Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our, Tony, there's a lot of background noise. Unfortunately, you might have to mute out. Somebody might be on the road. Welcome to our October 2022 Worker-Focused Science and Prevention. This week's installment comes to you without any intervention from me until the second half, so I just want to hand it right over to my colleague, Dr. Sarah Rhodes, who's an occupational epidemiologist, microbiologist, and advocate for worker-driven research. She was trained at the University of North Carolina School of Public Health, where she conducted research in partnership with workers to evaluate the spread of antibiotic-resistant bacteria from industrial animal operations to production workers, neighboring communities, and the environment. In 2019, Sarah moved to Toronto, where she began working with us at OCCOW and her epidemiological skills as a tool for investigating work-relatedness of health concerns raised by Ontario rubber and plastics production workers. She moved into this new position with us and as Director of Projects, working with Andrew Zarnke to advance our ongoing occupational disease and exposure investigations. In her downtime, Sarah and I have a lot in common, spending time near the water, singing Irish dancing, and cooking delicious meals with family and friends. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Kimberly, for that introduction. And welcome, everyone. Glad to see some familiar names and faces today. So before I pass over and also introduce the other folks who will be presenting with me today, I first wanted to start off with a land acknowledgement. And so based on the location of our central office, OCCOW acknowledges that we are on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that this land is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with the multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. And finally, we also acknowledge that our work to support Indigenous peoples specifically must extend beyond simple land acknowledgements. We're dedicated to providing Indigenous workers, as well as other worker groups experiencing discrimination and marginalization, with high quality consultations to address work-related medical and prevention needs. And so with that, we're really excited to bring to you this presentation today. And so I'll pass over actually to Jeavana to introduce herself as well, and then we'll move to Paul and Janice.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everyone. I'm Jeavana Srithran from the OCRC, the Occupational Cancer Research Centre at Ontario Health. I'm also a Status Assistant Professor at the Yarnell School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. And so I lead various projects under the Occupational Disease Surveillance Program at the OCRC. And my main focus has been with the Occupational Disease Surveillance System, referred to as the ODSS, where we look at various cancers and other health outcomes among approximately 2.4 million Ontario workers. And I'd be happy to share some of our findings today with all of you.
Do you want me to just go ahead, Sarah?
Go ahead, Paul.
Okay, sorry.
Sorry.
Somebody's going to tell me what to do.
Yes, you're ready.
Anyway,
you're ready.
My name is Paul. Okay, I'm Paul Demers. I'm the director of the Occupational Cancer Research Center. And like Jeavana, I'm also a faculty member with the Yarnell School of Public Health. I'm an epidemiologist. I also have training in occupational hygiene and have been in this area a long time.
Great, thank you, Paul, and over to Janice.
Hi, I'm Janice Martell. I am an occupational health coordinator with OCCOW, and I'm also the founder of the McIntyre Powder project that we're going to hear about today. Thanks.
Wonderful. Okay, so with that, we'll go ahead and get started with the presentation. So today we'll be presenting to you all about worker-based science. So we're really going to be focusing on where the voice of the worker and science meet. And so with that, let's get going. Let's see if this will actually, you know what, hold on. We're having one technical difficulty here. Let me see. Hold on one moment. Let me stop sharing just to make sure. Okay, let's try one more time to share. Can everyone see the slides?
Not yet, Sarah.
Okay.
No, we can. Yeah.
Okay, let me see if this will advance. Unfortunately, there we go. Is that advancing?
Yes.
Okay. Something changed from before. But with that, then we'll keep going. We'll get started. So what will we cover today? First, we're going to introduce you to worker-based research and what we mean by this term, worker-based, and the steps involved in occupational disease and exposure investigations. And then from there, we'll actually take 2 real-life case studies to show you in order to discuss these topics further. The first will be on salivary gland cancer among plastics and rubber workers in Ontario. And that will be first be given through the perspective of OCCOW and what we've seen at OCCOW clinics. And then we'll pass over to Jeavana to be able to hear more about this issue from the surveillance perspective from the data set that the OCRC runs. And then secondly, we'll go to another case study on neurodegenerative disease amongst mine workers exposed to McIntyre powder. And then similarly, we'll hear first from Janice with the OCCOW and worker perspective, and then move to the perspective of the surveillance research done at the OCRC. And then lastly, with all these case studies, we will discuss the implications and lessons learned from this work, and also discuss where we'll go from here. So to start, I will first like to talk about occupational disease and exposure investigations and the process that we usually follow. So a really important piece of this is that oftentimes these investigations do start with the worker voice. I'm getting a request to annotate, but I'm going to decline that for now. So oftentimes these investigations start with the worker voice. Do we see this? Can everyone see this, the pop-up of the annotation?
Yeah, perfectly. Oh, no, I don't see any of your pop-up requests.
So I'm getting a pop-up from Roger Isabel requesting to annotate. So I just want to make sure that that is okay. Roger, are you okay with that? Is there something happening with your WebEx? Hopefully we're all good. I think it just disappeared.
I can see it, Sarah.
Oh, you can. Okay.
Oh, great.
So hopefully that will be good. But so first and foremost, we start with the worker voice. So oftentimes workers raise concerns of suspected occupation-related illness and or harmful exposures that they believe may be occurring in their workplace. And then from there, we usually have the seeking of support. So workers will usually reach out to either their union representatives or other investigators. Similarly, clinics like OCCOW, we will receive worker requests for support to look more into the investigation of occupation and disease links. But hopefully, we would also hope that we wouldn't have to rely on workers to carry this burden of letting us know when they're having illness or experiences of exposure. We hope that there's also proactive research that can show early signs of a problematic exposure so that we can address it before we see any sort of worker illness. And then from there, usually after we receive a request from workers for support, we'll work to move towards an initial evaluation. So usually this will involve looking at how many cases are we seeing of a particular illness? Are there any hypothesized exposures that workers already believe may be connected to these cases? And then lastly, one of the most important pieces usually in these investigations is actually that we will identify prevention needs early on. So there might be, it might be difficult to connect the illness that we're seeing with an exposure that we're seeing. But even without being able to connect those things, sometimes we'll be able to say, oh, we see that there might be an exposure here that's harmful. Let's go ahead and work on prevention. So that's usually one of the most important outcomes of these types of investigations. And next, if we do see that there is, for example, a group of cases where the disease outcome is very specific or similar, that we have many new cases amongst workers who are working in the same department, for example, that there might be a reason to move into a further investigation. And this might involve data quality assessment. So looking at what data is available, is it of high quality? Do we have the ability to store and protect the data from workers in order to investigate a problem more deeply? And if all of that's true, we might decide to move to the point of looking to see if there's an actual ability to conduct a population-based epidemiologic study, or maybe even a workplace-specific epidemiologic study. And so with this, we might try to look at the feasibility by determining, do we see what might be an expected elevation in the rate of a certain illness compared to what we see in the general population, for example? And we might try to look at if there's mechanistic evidence. So if there's an ability for us to think about if there's already pathways we know about in the literature that would connect the illness to the exposure that we're seeing. We might continue to look into data quality and budget and resources for conducting a study like this. And then alternatively, we might think that there's a reason to pursue an exposure assessment. So is it feasible for us to move this investigation further into that space? So this might look at, in this case, we might look at, is there existing data on exposure? Do we have, for example, access to plant maps, to MSDS files, to other information around exposure at the plant? Is there a possibility to actually collect our own real-time monitoring data? And similarly, do we have the budget and resources? And then lastly, if all of these things come to play, we might be able to conduct a full study. So the point really here is that there are many steps that are involved in these occupational and exposure investigations. And sometimes the worker voice that we might start with may only lead up to an initial evaluation. It might proceed to an epidemiologic study, but it is very important that workers' voices do usually play a large role, as well as the active role of surveillance research in these processes. And so next, we wanted to bring the lens also of worker-based participatory research. Oftentimes, the involvement of workers is really important in the work that comes to show and better understand the connection between occupational exposures and illness. And oftentimes as well, I'm sure that many of you have heard the kind of false pretense that workers are a group of people who may need to be informed about exposures or diseases, whereas academics or people who are at a higher level or research level are experts that are able to provide that information, when really I want to kind of turn that on its head and have us remember that workers are experts in themselves, and they have expertise on what they're experiencing in their own bodies, as well as the exposures that they're experiencing as well. And in addition, the work tasks that they're involved in. So I think the really big piece here in this presentation is we want to be able to show you how much workers' voices do often play a role in leading to investigations. And so here, I wanted to talk more about worker engagement in these efforts. So in the slide previously, you saw that these investigations can move to an evaluation or a feasibility assessment, and worker engagement can improve all of those steps if we have workers' involvement in each of those. But if we actually go to the number 5, a full study being conducted, we have a lot of more work to do, and workers can really play a role as well in the conducting of this type of research. So for example, in the research design, workers are able to provide insight into the nature of their job tasks to inform our research questions and also sampling design schemes. They're also able to support in data collection and sampling. So in some of the work, I think if you all were here last week, you might have seen the work on nail salon workers. And there was deep worker involvement in those studies, where the workers were also involved in the real-time sampling of personal worker exposure as well as environmental sampling. So having that worker personal exposure sampling can be very important for these investigations. Workers can also be involved in the data analysis planning. They can help us to better understand some of the concerns of occupation and disease relationships that might warrant targeted investigation. And really, most importantly, workers can be very, very important in the dissemination and report back of research results, because they're usually very connected to the worker community. And so if we have research that's coming out either at a surveillance level or at a level that might be more workplace specific, they're able to support and reach their colleagues and make sure that the results are communicated back in an accessible manner. And then lastly, intervention design. We need worker support in order to identify the best interventions. One really great example is in work that I have done previously with industrial animal production workers. One of the main interventions that was given was to be wearing a mask to prevent exposure to antibiotic-resistant bacteria, but a lot of the workers gave feedback that the types of masks that were being given were causing them to have heat stress, and that was causing a whole other problem for them. So we were able to work with them to find the best solution, and I think that shows the example of how workers can really support in interventions. And so lastly, here in this presentation, we really want to bridge the gap between workers and the science, and showing that there is a lot of back and forth relationships that occur, especially in the field of occupational health. And with that, we're going to move into our first case study on salivary gland cancer. So we'll first look at this group of rare salivary gland cancers that we've seen amongst Ontario plastics and rubber workers from the clinic perspective at OCCOW. And then I'll pass over to Jeavana to discuss more of what they've found at their surveillance level in larger population-based data sets. So what is salivary gland cancer? Salivary gland cancer is a rare cancer. So by that, the definition is given as less than 6 cases per 100,000 population per year. There are multiple different glands that can be affected, the parotid, submandibular, and sublingual glands. And for this cancer, because it's so rare, there actually is very limited evidence on connections to occupational and environmental exposures, but there are more and more research studies coming out that have indicated potential associations between salivary gland cancer and exposure to these items here. For example, radiation, radioiodines, nickel compounds, and lastly, rubber and plastics manufacturing, which we will focus on today. So in this case at OCCOW, it was very true that we saw this path moving forward of hearing from workers and seeing that workers were presenting to the clinics from the rubber and plastics industries with salivary gland cancer and seeking support from our clinics. And from there, we actually did move to the stage of an initial evaluation. So we were able to take inventory of how many cases we were seeing, be able to look at some hypothesized exposures that could be associated with this, and also try to work with the workers to think of immediate prevention needs that could be addressed. And so with this at OCCOW, we saw 8 cases of salivary gland cancer captured at OCCOW over time. And so with this, given that it's such a rare cancer and also the extent of how many workers we know were working in these workplaces, we were seeing that this was a signal that 8 cases would be something to look into further. And they were all coming from the same industries, both rubber and plastics industries. So this led us to ask questions of, do we think this is an elevated rate compared to what's seen in the general population, for example? And through back of the envelope calculations, we were able to see that, yes, there might be a signal here. And so we wanted to look further into whether these workers had common job types or common exposures, and if there was feasibility for further investigation. And so where do we go from there? The workers' voices led to us at the clinics having this first catch of the issue. And that led to OCCOW going forward with the top section, the exposure assessments, as well as the OCRC looking into epidemiologic studies at a population level of this issue. So first I'll go through the OCCOW piece and then Jeavana will talk about the OCRC. So in order to investigate this, we've started looking into doing a case series. So what this means is that we have a group of rubber workers and a group of plastics workers who've shown up with this cancer. And we're trying to see if, given that we have very extensive information about their work histories and the exposures that they experienced, if there's any overlapping exposures that we can see even at the smaller clinic level. And so the purpose of this is to write a document that can be able to describe and summarize this. So the first step, as I said, was identifying the cases, reviewing them, then moving to the step of a literature review, where we tried to look at connections between occupational and environmental exposures that might be connected to salivary gland cancer. And some of these that we found in the literature related to plastics and rubber were things like nitrosamines, solvents, ionizing radiation, etc. So we were able to look at whether these workers could have experienced any of these exposures. And then we conducted an exposure assessment, drawing on various sources, one of which was actually for one of the plants that we had worked with, there was a retrospective exposure profile conducted, which you can actually access at OCCOW's website, which was one that told us a lot more about what were the exposures at the plants. And we were able to look at each worker and determine whether we thought they were exposed or not to various exposures. And then lastly, our end goal here will be to actually publish these results. Before I go into that, I wanted to show you just a quick example of one of the tables. So you can see here that the goal would be to have for each worker a documentation of their exposure histories, which would give us how many years they worked in this type of industry, either plastics or rubber, which job tasks did they have, and based on these different job tasks, whether yes or no, we think they were exposed to these various agents. So for example, solvents, asbestos, nitrosamines, and then we can look across the group to see if there were any common exposures. So for here, this as one example here, solvents being one that could be potentially shared exposure amongst the group of plastics and rubber workers. So this work continues, and we'll be hopefully being able to share more with you soon. But At this stage, I'm going to pass off to Jeavana so she can discuss what was found in comparison to the clinic level, which you see here, what has been found about salivary gland cancer at the surveillance level in Ontario. So Jeavana, I'll pass over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. So as Sarah highlighted, there is a need to investigate workplace exposures in the development of salivary gland cancer. And using our existing Ontario cohorts, where we have work information, we can examine this further. So first, I'd just like to briefly provide some background on the surveillance system that we use at the OCRC that was used to examine salivary gland cancer. So the Occupational Disease Surveillance System, it's a unique system that we can use to identify work-related disease in Ontario. And we can identify at-risk workers and potential hazardous exposures that are involved within the workplace. We can investigate both cancers and non-malignant diseases across hundreds of occupation and industry groups. And we continuously update the cohort. So right now we've got about 2.37 million Ontario workers with an accepted lost time compensation claim between 1983 and 2019. And so a worker who was compensated for a workplace related injury or illness that resulted in missing work is captured in this provincial compensation board database. And the database does include job information such as the worker's occupation and industry group that was coded at the time of the claim. So with this, we have the ability to explore hundreds of occupation and industry groups and track cancers and other diseases. To specifically identify incident cases of salivary gland cancer, workers were linked to the Ontario Cancer Registry with data up to the year 2020. And we do have funding from the Ministry of Labour and the Ministry of Health for work that we do with the ODSS. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is really just a brief description of the number of cases that we see in the ODSS. So we identified 878 incident cases of salivary gland cancer, and the majority were in males, which we did expect to see. So we can move to the next slide. And so the next few slides, I'm just going to highlight some of the interesting results that we observed when looking at salivary gland cancer among Ontario workers. And here you can see rubber and plastic product workers and their percent increase in risk compared to all other workers within the cohort. And the asterisk at the bottom really represents increased risks that are statistically significant. But it's interesting to share these overall and then with males only. We know that several previous studies have found increased risks of salivary gland cancer among workers in plastic and rubber product manufacturing. And although these may not all be significant, we did see some interesting findings. And the increased risk has been attributed to exposure to nitrosamines present in rubber and styrene in composite plastics and synthetic rubber. So among the workers in the ODSS, an increased risk was observed only for men working in the plastics fabricating industry, and no increased risks were observed among other rubber and plastic occupations or industries. So the varying results may be due to the rarity of the cancer, making it challenging to identify cases across different occupation industry groups. But again, we're highlighting some of the interesting findings that we do see. Next slide, please. So another interesting group that we saw elevated risks for was in nursing, particularly among female workers, which is a small percent of the group that we have, which is interesting given that, it is a small number of cases, but we were able to pull out at least a number of females that we could report on. And nursing assistants were observed to have more than twice the risk of salivary gland cancer compared to all other workers in the ODSS. And workers in the sector are exposed to various carcinogens that we know of, radiation from diagnostic imaging or radiation therapy equipment, and potentially formaldehyde, which has been previously linked to salivary gland cancer. We also know that healthcare workers may also be exposed to the Epstein-Barr virus, which has been implicated in the development of certain subtypes of salivary gland tumors. Next slide. So the last group I'd like to highlight are the metal-related and mining workers. And workers in the metal mining industry and mining and quarrying occupations were found to have an increased risk of salivary gland cancer. These findings are comparable to previous research where an increased risk was seen amongst these occupations with potential exposures that Sarah had mentioned, so metal and metal alloys. But workers in metal-related jobs may also be exposed to other things like chromium-6 compounds, which have been also linked to salivary gland cancer. And workers in mining and quarrying or metal-related work could potentially be exposed to silica dust, asbestos, diesel engine exhaust, although we don't really know how these exposures are linked to salivary gland cancer. So these results demonstrate how we can look at rare diseases in our surveillance work that we've been doing. And salivary gland cancer has not only been explored in the ODSS, but also in another cohort of workers at the OCRC, the mining master file, which includes only Ontario miners. So in the next 2 slides, I'll share some of the results from the mining cohort, which will provide a more in-depth understanding of salivary gland cancer risk within these mining workers. Next slide, please. So here you can see results from the mining master file. And really, I'm not going to go into too much detail about the mining master file. Paul will touch upon this in his presentation that follows. But basically, this graph is, really a comparison of each group in the mining master file, including the complete mining cohort and their 3 predominant ore types mined, and if they were ever mined. So here, this is based on 61,397 male hard rock miners, but findings only showed 54 cases of salivary gland cancer, half of which were in uranium mining. And we will take a closer look at this on the next slide, but you can see that the standardized incidence ratio is quite high for uranium. So we'll go to the next slide. Perfect. So this graph is really interesting because this shows the total employment years in each of the predominant ores compared to the Ontario population. And we wanted to share this data because there's a clear relationship between uranium mining and salivary gland cancer. And maybe this is related to radon exposure, other radiation exposure, but we also saw an increased risk across some of the mining groups in the ODSS, and they could be also exposed to various metals. So it is clear that the risk is, rises monotonically from 0 years all the way to 10 or more years in uranium mining. But given that so little is known about it, it's important to look at the results across these various cohorts with the available cases that we have to explore potential occupations or industries that are at risk. And next slide, please. Thank you. So given that little is known on this cancer, and because of how rare it is, we know that prevention strategies are quite limited, and workers in certain industries and occupations have shown increased risk of salivary gland cancer in our cohorts highlighted in this presentation. But findings from both cohorts are valuable. This can help to direct future research, potentially understand what exposures are involved in these identified groups. And although it's challenging for us to interpret some of these findings, we can definitely continue to explore them further. So with that, I'd like to move to the second part of our presentation that's going to be presented by Janice and Paul on neurodegenerative disease among mine workers exposed to McIntyre powder. So I'll pass it to Janice now.
Thanks so much. My apologies, I just had a big coughing fit, so if that happens again, I may have to mute myself. So this is about the McIntyre Powder project, and my father, Jim Hobbs, was an underground miner who was exposed without choice to aluminum inhalation. Next slide, please. McIntyre powder is finely ground aluminum dust, and there was a theory that if you inhaled this dust, that you would it would prevent the lung disease silicosis, which was quite rampant in mines. And in 1943. This started to be used regularly every work shift. You see in the top right-hand photograph, that is the aluminum dust being blown out, and you can see the level of the benches where workers would be changing their clothes every day to go underground. And the middle slide shows what it looks like. It's very much like toner fluid. It's the toner, the dry toner that you would put in photocopiers. Very, very fine. And the last picture is mine workers at Campbell Red Lake Mine in, I believe it was around 1966, waiting on the man deck before they went underground for their aluminum dust treatments. And it's quite dirty and hazy in there because that was the room that it was administered in. Over around 25 to 27,000 Northern Ontario mine workers were exposed to this. also used globally in the United States in silica dust producing industries such as brick manufacturing, refractories, things like that. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about bridging the gap, when I found out that my dad was exposed to McIntyre powder and he ended up with Parkinson's, my concern was that, you know, did the exposure and having to inhale a neurotoxin cause his Parkinson's? Because there was none in our family. He was one of 11 brothers and sisters and parents that lived, you know, late in life. And my philosophy or my thought was, you know, how do I get in touch with people who could research this and scientists, and how do I get this out there? And I decided that I needed to ask other workers if they were also sick. So I started a voluntary registry, the McIntyre Powder Project. I did a lot of research on this and started talking to other workers, and found out that there was many other workers who also had Parkinson's and several other kinds of diseases like COPD, sarcoidosis, things that that I had concerns with, that either other mining exposures or the McIntyre powder may have had something to do with. And I think it's really important, and my ultimate goal in my McIntyre Powder Project work is to create some sort of a national surveillance system over the worker's lifetime, because it's, you know, occupational diseases can take 20, 30, 40 years to develop. And if we're not looking at these workers over their lifetime, we're not going to notice that. And where I saw the gap was that we really weren't monitoring what happened to these mine workers, many of whom are retired or deceased already. And workers are the evidence of occupational disease. If you're exposing workers to toxins, toxic elements, and they get sick, that sickness is some evidence that requires investigation. So through my voluntary registry, we kind of built up enough momentum. And next slide, please. That the occupational health clinics for Ontario workers became involved. The United Steelworkers helped us sponsor and organize some intake clinics in Sudbury and Timmins. And really, in bridging that gap, we have to create that space to listen to workers and what they're telling us. Next slide, please. And the media made all the difference. You know, these stories were horrific. You know, front page of the Toronto Star, the Fifth Estate, you know, and thank goodness for lots of local journalism, CBC Radio and Northern Ontario Business and various Sudbury Star and LA Lake Standard, and just where workers are going to hear those stories at the local level. And it really highlighted, you know, people were, like I was, appalled that this had happened to workers, and appalled that workers weren't followed up on to see, you know, over the long term, to see if they were okay. And because of this, one of the issues in trying to go in doing individual like workers' claims and stuff is that the WSAB had a policy that automatically denied claims of neurological disorders related to occupational aluminum exposure. There's a whole other story about that, but I want to leave time for Dr. Demers to talk about his research with the Occupational Cancer Research Center, because eventually the WSAB in 2017 did engage the Occupational Cancer Research Center to do a study on neurological disorders and McIntyre powder to see if there was any statistically significant difference. Next slide, please. That's my dad, by the way, Jim Hobbs, on a better day when he was having Parkinson's, when he was dealing with that. And the research was published in 2020, and just Dr. Demers will speak about that, but miners who were exposed to McIntyre powder did have elevated rates, statistically significant elevated rates of Parkinson's. And now Parkinson's, as of February 2022, the Minister of Labour, Monty McNaughton, announced that McIntyre powder based Parkinson's was added as an occupational disease to the Workplace Safety and Insurance Act regulations, the Schedule 3. And that's the first time in 28 years that a new occupational disease has been added. So it's a huge advancement to what we were dealing with a few years ago before this happened. Next slide. And now I can introduce Dr. Paul Demers, and you can tell us about it. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Janice. That was great. It gives people, I think, a real good introduction to this topic, which is a very, it's a bad piece of Ontario history. I was didn't know much about it until I moved to Ontario 12 years ago, and one of the first things was that Andy King from the Steelworkers gave me a little vial of this and explained me the whole story. So that was my first kind of introduction to it. For those of you who don't know, the Occupational Cancer Research Centre is based in Ontario Health, originally was in Cancer Care Ontario, and is primarily funded by the Ontario Ministry of Labour, Immigration, Training and Skills Development. It's a mouthful now. Can I have the next slide, please? As Janice mentioned, we were first asked to look into this issue in 2017 when the WSIB approached the OCRC to ask if we could examine the risk of neurologic disease among miners using the mining master file. And we had been using the mining master file for some years already, so we were quite familiar with it. We were looking at it initially for looking at radon and lung cancer, but we've used it to look at a variety of different issues, as you saw in Jeavana's presentation, most recently looking at salivary gland cancer and mining. In 2018, we actually signed an agreement with the WSIB, so they funded the study for us to look at this. It took a while to arrive at the agreement. I mean, typically, when a study is commissioned by the WSIB, it would be a contract, and it's written very differently than a grant would be, where we have a greater degree of independence, and which we really wanted to have in order to do this. Could I have the next slide, please? The mining master file is really is a resource that was created initially in paper form to track people who were screened for silicosis. And there was a time when annual medical exams were required of all miners, and the mining master file was actively maintained from 1927 through 1987. I should say the actual mining master file was created in 1951. Prior to that, it was paper cards. But in 1951, which is quite early, it was changed into, they created punch cards from that and created an electronic file. So that was a very early development. It was really in the 1970s that it started being used pretty actively for research, and has played an important role in the history of miners' health in Ontario. For those of you who don't know, it played a role in the Ham Commission, which is back in 1974. So it has a history of being used to look at important issues in mining. Each year, miners are asked about what they had done in the previous year, what mines they'd worked at. And so it really is a great resource for mining research. Could I have the next slide, please? This is what one of the paper cards look like, and I'll explain to you why this is kind of interesting. I mean, it's gone through a number of versions of these paper cards, but you'll notice here a little column under the examinations. So they were giving people chest x-rays. That's what that unusual machine was that they had in the previous slide. But they also asked people at those annual exams whether they had been exposed to aluminum dust or McIntyre powder. So that's the little AL is there circled in red in the middle. So it gave us an ability to at least identify people quite easily in terms of their reporting that they were exposed to aluminum dust. Prior to 1951, when the computer file was created, they actually used records where they knew it was being used at different mines. They actually used that to flag the exposure to aluminum dust. Can I have the next slide, please? Before starting this study, the WSIB gave us access to the paper files because there's always been questions. Well, we have an electronic file. Is it really, how representative is it of everybody who's underwent those kind of chest X-rays? So we pulled 500 kind of randomly selected people in the paper records, and we did the same in the electronic records, and we tried to find them in the different sources to make sure that in fact we were really identifying everybody. And there were only 4 people that we could find out of 1,000 that didn't match. So that's pretty good for a database that was really initially created using really old style punch cards, which for many of you may be too young to remember what these were. These were paper cards that would be fed into a card reader before computer files were really being kept electronically. We did a little bit of cleaning on that data set to try to remove people who were in there twice and combine the different history pieces together, which is something else we got access to the paper records to check on. And then submitted it to the Institute for Clinical and Evaluative Studies to do the electronic record linkage to both physician billing data and hospital records, as well as ambulatory care data, which includes emergency room visits. And overall, we were successful in linking 36,000 of those, 36,800 of those minors to there. That's because many of the people in the mining master file, it's a very old data set, and many of them had already passed away or maybe moved to other provinces, we're not sure. But we were successful in linking almost 37,000 of them. Can I have the next slide, please? We looked at McIntyre powder in 2 different ways. One is what we would call self-report. That is when the miners came in, if they actually stated that they had been exposed, that was a little check mark put in their in the paper records, and then that was entered into the computer. But we also went through and we we developed a list of all the mines that had used McIntyre powder based upon historic records, and the records that we used really agreed very closely with the same mines that were identified by Janice's group in terms of knowing where these were. So we had a kind of a double check on the accuracy of those records, and it really identified a lot more miners that had been exposed, but it also identified a lot more years that people had been exposed, because they might not remember to say every year. They might have thought it was enough to say it once. So it allowed us to look at that history of exposure a lot better. Next slide, please. And this is the real basic result. The red thing is with the self-reports, and the blue one is with using the historic records to identify more miners that had been exposed to McIntyre powder. You can see we find generally pretty similar using the those two different sources of records. Sometimes a little stronger with one versus the other, but pretty comparable. But what you'll see there is that the biggest increased risk that we found overall, this is in all the miners who have been exposed to McIntyre powder, was for Parkinson's disease. And I'll go to the next slide, please. And I should have stated even on that previous one that one there means that the group has the same risk of neurologic disease as people who weren't exposed to McIntyre powder, different miners who weren't exposed. And what we have here is how many years people were in the mines and forced to inhale McIntyre powder on every day they went to work. And you can see here that the first bar there is a year or less. The next one is 1 to 5 years. The third one, the green one, is 5 to 10, and then greater than 10 is the purple one. You don't see much difference across those when you look at Alzheimer's disease or motor neuron disease, although there were very few cases of that. The motor neuron disease we're especially interested in was Lou Gehrig's disease. But you do see a pretty clear pattern for Parkinson's disease. And for Parkinsonism, you also see a higher risk in that last group, the group that was over 10 years. Although when we looked at it closely, what we found was they were the same people who were later on diagnosed as having Parkinson's disease. So that's what really drove that result. It really is the people who had a diagnosis of Parkinson's disease in the medical records that we're seeing the increased risk in. I'll go to the next slide. And this is my last one, so I don't want to carry on for too long here. So our conclusion really was that McIntyre powder exposure was associated with Parkinson's disease and to some extent with Parkinsonism, but the excess in Parkinsonism was due to Parkinson's disease. The risk of Parkinson's disease increased very clearly with duration of exposure, which is something we look for when we want to make sure that what we're seeing is something that's actually due to what people are working with. And something that I didn't show you is that the highest risk was amongst people who were exposed in 1956 or later. And the reason that that's important is in 1956, they changed the formulation and generated a lot finer dust. And we think the finer dust gets into the body and into the nervous system more effectively than the larger particles. At least that's the theory. We didn't see that kind of relationship with Alzheimer's disease or motor neuron disease, although among all minors that we were looking at, there was an increase of Alzheimer's and motor neuron compared to the general population, but it didn't seem to be associated with McIntyre powder. And that's it for me. So I guess we can move to this last one, and I'll turn it back over to Sarah, please.
Thanks so much, Paul, and Jeavana and Janice as well. So we are here to thank you so much, everyone, for listening to our presentation. We've got some acknowledgements here. First to Ontario workers who have helped us to better understand their exposures and concerns, as well as some other members of the OCCOW team listed here, specifically Andrew, Dave, Kimberly, and Val, as well as the broader physician and hygienist teams who helped provide feedback and support. And then for the OCRC team, Dr. Sritharan and Dr. Demers, of course, but then also we have Dr. Zhang, Suman, Dr. DeBonno, I don't know how to pronounce Colin's last name, but I'll say Colin for now, Dr. Yarnell, Dr. Harris, and Jill McLeod for their support on the research on salivary gland cancer and neurodegenerative disease as well. And thank you as well to the sponsors of this work. And I think we'll now open up to questions if we're all ready. So let me stop sharing my screen actually for a moment and go to the chat. I think I can see the chat actually here.
Great, Sarah. And yeah, perfect. If you can't right now, I can read you one.
Great. That would be wonderful, Kimberly.
There is one from Victor Reed. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Victor Reed, and I'm a public health student at sunny Downstate. I joined the presentation late due to technical difficulties. Wondering if the slides will be shared. Oh, sorry, I didn't read the whole thing. I was with you. Yes, we will, Victor, share the slides on our website the week later with the video of the presentation. My apologies. Sorry, Sarah. I was just buying you time to get rid of your shared screen.
No problem. All right, there we go. Great.
We were hoping, yeah, hope we can. Well, I just want to invite people to unmute or ask questions or throw them in the chat. Don't be shy. And while you're thinking of a question, I just wanted to say how amazing this presentation was and put together with Sarah's. This has been her suggestion and leading the force here. And it's funny, no matter what we seem to be, OCCOW seems to continue to be the best kept secret. I don't know why. And people are often wondering what we do in the clinics, and we really wanted to show, you know, hardcore what the clinic work is here. And even in the scientific world, we've seen Jeavana and Paul do presentations on their work, but often it skips the clinic part and the worker part, and it's because they're presenting the surveillance piece. So we're trying to tie all this together a little bit and show people how this how this works. So I hope that that's been effective for people. So Kate's sharing. Oh, Sarah, you can see now. Apologies, over to you.
Well, so I just saw Jeavana and Paul, we've got a question from Todd in the chat for you. Can you explain the difference between Parkinsonism and Parkinson's disease, actually as well for Janice, if any of you want to take that one on?
I'll say I'm not that kind of doctor. Maybe Janice would have a better answer than I would.
I was going to cop out to you, but my understanding is Parkinsonism has it has Parkinson's-like features, but not full-blown Parkinson's. But that's a very layperson's understanding. Interestingly, we've had a handful of people with really inexplicable, like Parkinson's-like conditions, but it's sort of towards Lewy body, or it's they might think it's progressive supranuclear palsy, degenerative brain disorder, things like that make me wonder a lot about that. Things that may not show up as statistically significant, but are concerning because they have these weird neurological things that nobody can seem to figure out for a diagnosis. So that's one of those things in the back of my mind that bothers me. Hi, Linda.
Hi. I have a question.
Go for it.
So our family is submitting a claim to WSIB for our father who, like Janice's, worked in the mines for, well, probably 30, 40 years, and was right there during the dates that you said, both when the powder was not as fine and when it became finer. He worked underground throughout that time and was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. Now, here's my question. The WSIB requires a certificate of death or a diagnosis, an evidence of diagnosis that we have been unable to get a hold of because his doctors are either deceased, retired, or we don't know how to get this information. So I'm just, you know, as families start to go through the process of, first of all, registering and then submitting a claim to WSIB, it's pretty difficult to put together all the information that's required, given that much time has passed. And interestingly enough, we never associated Dad's Parkinson's disease with, we didn't even know he was breathing in McIntyre powder. Like, he never mentioned it. So we're having a hard time gathering that evidence, I guess what you say, that he had Parkinson's, other than just anecdotal stories about how, you know, he was shaking, he couldn't smile, his face was frozen, he couldn't walk at the end. He had all the symptoms, but we just don't have that document. You got any advice for me?
I can say that we had one other family where the gentleman had died quite a while back, the worker. They had like his bracelet, like the medical alert bracelet. They had a photo of that, and they didn't have medical records either. But it was like little things like that were able to add up. It's frustrating, and this is my whole point to the necessity to monitor these workers over their lifetime. And if you're exposed to these things, those medical records should be somewhere where they're accessible. You know, in Ontario anyways, once an adult is no longer serviced by a physician for, I think it's 10 years, they can destroy the medical records and have no liability for that.
Yeah, like we have the name of the neurologist who diagnosed him, but we can't locate that doctor. We can't find him. Or well, we're going through the hospital that he would have worked at it. But thank you for that, because what we're trying to do is put together sort of anecdotal evidence of that Dad had Parkinson's disease, like his involvement in the Parkinson Foundation. Both he and my mom were belong to that organization. Now, why would they have joined that organization out of the blue if neither of them had Parkinson's? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think that if you gather whatever you can, whether it's photographs showing him in that state, anything that you can, even if it's denied at the WSIB level, you may succeed at the tribunal level. So it's tough. Witness statements, people who knew him, anything that you can get.
Okay, thank you.
It's your reality. It's what you lived with, and it feels like it feels like a slap in the face when it's not recognized when when you're finally in this situation. And my dad never talked about it either. It was literally somebody else that brought it up one day and about aluminum dust, and he said, "Yeah, McIntyre powder," and it was horrifying to me that he knew about it, that there was some name that he had, he knew about the name, and he just never talked about it.
These were big, tough men.
These
were strong, hardworking men who never complained.
Yep.
Yeah, and thank you, Linda. Your that voice is what we're trying to bring to so thank you for your question. Laura Verma mentions the Office of the Worker Advisor. She's a legal representative there. That's another resource in addition to our services that can help. And we hope that we've indicated to you how important the voice and the experience of the worker is to the science, and then vice versa. And that's really what the link and the bridge we're trying to show today. And Linda, you've done that beautifully. Sarah, there are a couple of questions. We do kind of have to go quickly, but I'll let you pick.
Absolutely. So we see some more questions through, and as well, Linda, definitely feel free to keep in contact with us. Just to make, we can follow up as well and see if there's more support that we can give, as well as the Office of the Worker Advisor. There's some more ideas flowing in my brain, but I want more time to speak with you about it. So I think I'll do that, as well as Paul's question in the chat about the mining master file record for.
Okay, can we arrange for me to get your contact information off after this call?
We will
Thank you.
The contact
To
in the
mirror
chat.
you two up.
Yeah.
Okay, we're good.
And yeah, so thank you for sharing that though, and we'll be in touch.
And I just want to say thank you to Janice Martell, because if it hadn't been for you, we wouldn't have known any of this. So thank you, Janice. Your work has been amazing.
Welcome.
Absolutely. Thank you, Janice. And I think we have one more question I think we'll do, and then we'll have to go. But we have a question from Kevin. Do you have any thoughts on why Alzheimer's is more elevated in minors?
No, we've continued to try to look at these things. We're looking at both exposure to radon and to diesel engine exhaust. As of yet, we really don't have anything really clear showing what that might be, but it's something that we'll continue to look at. I mean, there's a challenge with mining is just, it's such a dangerous profession, and there's lots of hazards in there. One of the things we've been interested is even, people getting head injuries and things like that, because you could easily be banging your head on things in a dark environment when you're underground. So, and that's been associated with some neurologic problems with people. So there's a lot of things left to look at, I think.
Thanks, Paul. All right. Well, with that, I think we'll have to close our session in order to make room for the next. But thanks so much to you all. I want to just put a shout out as well in the chat. We've put a link to the survey. We've actually created a survey. We would love to hear your feedback on what you thought about the presentation. And also that will include the next presentation as well. So you can wait until the end of the full 2-hour session to fill it in. But thanks so much. And thank you, Janice, Paul, and Jeavana, for all of your work on the presentation. And we'll move to the next one.
Thanks, folks. And
Thanks, everybody.
yeah, and I put the website in there, responding to Victor, and it has all the sessions. Last week was a similar, trying to show worker-informed science and the voice of the worker. Our work is really on the tertiary prevention, or the clinical work, then leads to, some of the other weeks in the secondary and primary prevention efforts, meaning, we have the voice of the worker and we have the illness, and we try to make that work-related connection and then drive the science. But then we also want to prevent these workers from getting sick in the first place. And that's where we try to influence the change, as you saw in the diesel particulate session that Kevin moderated. And we talked about the silica tool coming through the Occ Illness Steering Committee. So, and this half, we want to talk about firefighters. So I'm going to hand it over now to one of our occupational hygienists, Todd Eyrich. When we put together this session, we had Sonia, we had John, we had a bunch of hygienists and physicians who have worked with firefighters on various occupational health nurses, on various occupational health issues. And we thought, well, we want to show how the workers' voice and the various unions with the firefighters led to some of the science piece and sort of draw that bridge again for you this half. So over to you, Todd, to introduce Steve to us.
Okay, thanks, Kimberly. I'd like to introduce Steve Yarnell, who is a health and safety specialist with the International Association of Firefighters, Health and Safety Medicine Division. He recently retired as a battalion chief from the Prince William County Fire Department in the state of Virginia, where he led their health and safety program. Steve currently works with Neil McMillan, who recently took a position with the IAFF as Director of Science and Research. We at OCOW, as Kimberly mentioned, have worked with Neil and others when he was a WSIB and health and safety specialist with the Ottawa firefighters, investigating and advocating for denied claims involving cancer, cardiovascular, and other occupational diseases. We're also looking at various prevention strategies, including biological monitoring. Looking forward to hearing your presentation, Steve.
Thank you. Appreciate the introduction, and good afternoon to everybody. I'm going to start by, let's see if I can get my slide to advance. I'm going to go over some firefighter exposure.
You'll just have to share your slides, Steve.
That's true. I will need to do that. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. So many practice sessions. I know.
I know, right?
I know. It's the way it
All
goes.
for naught.
Yeah.
I'll go over some exposure characterization and talk about the evidence-based action we're working on, some new areas of focus.
Sorry to interrupt. We still don't see your slide.
Sorry.
No worries. And we do now. You're absolutely on target. Thanks.
Gotta press OK.
Okay.
Sorry, to recap, firefighter exposure characterization, then go over some evidence-based action we're involved in, some new areas of focus. Going to talk about the commitment from leadership here and some new and existing partnerships we want to begin to leverage. So we have a philosophy that if it's in the air or it's on your skin, then it's going to get in your body. Just no two ways about it. There used to be a time where firefighters worried about inhaling things. You know, we had SCBA, and we thought by using that, we were doing everything we needed to do. And now we're finding out that not only do we need to avoid the smoke, but we need to really redefine what does smoke mean? We used to think it was just the stuff you could see, but obviously there's substances, particles in the smoke that we want to avoid as well. But we're also learning that it's not just inhalation. There's also many other ways it gets in our body, not the least of which is absorption and ingestion when these things are in the air and we can't see it. Unfortunately, we've been able to have more support than ever before from scientists and epidemiologists, and we're learning more and more about these dangerous hazards and what we need to do about it. As I was mentioning, you know, there's a great unseen risk here. 97% of the particulate found during overhaul, which is the period of time after the fire is extinguished, but while we're still working to stabilize the incident, that particulate is invisible to the human eye. And you can see from these photos that it's not just the firefighters that are on the insides of the building that we're worried about. Smoke travels and can have an impact no matter where we are in the fire ground. It's necessary that we really do a job analysis of every task, not only on the fire ground, but in all the incidents we run. I know we had an experience in my fire department where we went to a medical call, and the subject that was ill was actually ill from carbon monoxide poisoning. And we had unwittingly walked into a building that was heavily laden with carbon monoxide. As you know, is a colorless, odorless gas. And we had to begin using our atmospheric monitoring before we went into calls that had certain type of sickness associated with it. But before we encountered it, we didn't know that was a hazard we need to be aware of. And as you all probably know, people who are working in occupational health, the absorption varies on different parts of the body. Depending on where you're exposed, can have a different impact. And this graphic here on the left side of the screen is meant to show where our firefighting ensemble comes together. And you can see that where different components come together, we have different levels of exposure in those areas. We thought that we were doing everything we can when we wear our full ensemble in a CBA, but there's still a risk associated with it, and we still have exposure to our skin, even though we're doing the best things we can. Now, fortunately, we have advocates like the IARC, and their recent monograph has helped to document that these hazards are real and they're causing cancer. So much so that even though there've been elements of our job that were identified as exposing us to cancer, like diesel exhaust and smoke, they helped identify that just the job itself is carcinogenic, and that helps to raise awareness with firefighters, of course, but also with the medical providers that are supposed to be taking care of us when we're sick. So with this elevated awareness, we get an increased focus. So, we have more and more attention on the hazards. One of the latest things that's come up is PFAS, and we're finding that it's not only in the various products that might be on fire in the buildings we go to, but it's actually in our turnout gear as well. And, through the best intentions of people trying to make the best products they can to support firefighters, these things are on their products and are getting in our skin. Additional exposures are coming from flame retardants they put in our uniforms. And all of these things, all of the components of our job, we start to realize that we have actual contamination, not only in the apparatus we ride in, because that's where we bring some of our dirty gear, but it's getting into the station as well, even though we try our very best to clean ourselves before we get back to the station and before we walk in to the parts of the building that we occupy and live in and sleep in. These chemicals and their particulate are carried on our clothing and on our body, and we carry them into the station, and they just get everywhere, whether we do a good job of being conscientious or not. And another part of that is in how we launder our PPE and our uniforms. Our PPE gets extremely dirty, and we have industrial washers to clean them, but there's still a transfer of those materials from the incident scene to the station, and again, through our best efforts, we still end up contaminating ourselves a little bit. And we're finding some of this laundering doesn't do everything it needs to do to reduce the contaminants that are there. So fortunately, our organization, my organization, the International Association of Firefighters, supports an expanding funding for cancer research. The General President, Edward Kelly, recently committed $500,000 to expand cancer research, and we're going to be a part of that, the Science and Research Division, and hopefully do some real good in forwarding, advocacy for cancer research in the fire department. But that's not all. We have advocates like the American Cancer Society and the Canadian Cancer Society, the Firefighter Cancer Support Network, the IARC, and of course our organization here to partner up and work together to expand research and, really expand the dialogue of it. How can we advocate for the job of the firefighter and reduce mortality? We also want to participate in some of the industry standard development. So the NFPA is really the primary consensus standard we use to develop some of the products we use. And NFPA 1971 and 1970 are intended to develop a standard for the construction and the development of a firefighter ensemble and the SCBA that we use. And within those standards, they have, guidelines for how to construct them, what materials should we use, how do we make sure they last, how long should we use them, try to make sure they don't break down over time, or at least over a reasonable amount of time they should be in service, and identify what is the life cycle for these tools that we use to protect ourselves. So we're going to participate in those talks to make sure that they're doing the best they can to protect firefighters. We're also trying to implement some new research partnerships. We have the Environmental Working Group. They're working on PFAS exposures, and they're going to be gathering a group of firefighters in the DC metro area here. And we're going to work to see what we can learn from that. There's initiatives through the Firefighter Cancer Initiative with the University of Miami that's going to study firefighter cancer, and another effort through the University of Michigan pursuing a grant through the NIH. That's the National Institutes of Health here in Washington, D.C., and collaborate with firefighters to learn some more from that. Also, this group here, the Science and Research Division, has leveraged a medical expert pilot program where we're collaborating with Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, to leverage that medical expertise in their Bloomberg School of Public Health to support workers' compensation claims. And in some cases where, the person that's affected may not really know anything about the cancer they have, and we're going to leverage that medical expertise to try to get that support and work with workers' comp and find out what the best treatments are and forward those things to the benefit of the firefighter. But basically, my organization, the IAFF, and their science and research section is fully committed to supporting firefighter health research in any area we can. We looking at new scientific findings to develop recommendations, develop these relationships with the academics and people in occupational health, and anytime we can provide information to our firefighters and the membership at large to make sure that they're well informed and being as safe as they can in doing their job to protect their citizens. I'll just sum up with some quick data. 30% of the deaths in Canada were the result of cancer. This is a data point from 2018, but 86% of the Canadian firefighters' deaths were from cancer. So we need to reduce the number of overall cancer deaths, obviously, but there needs to be a reduction to get us back to what would be a normal, normal rate of cancer deaths, instead of making it worse to have the job of firefighter. And that's all I got.
Thank you so much, Steve. We're going to move on to our next speaker, and folks, hold your questions or write them in the chat, because we're going to keep Steve until after our next two speakers present, because it's such, I mean, really, we're trying to show worker-informed. This group is a great example of it. OCCOW's work with firefighters through the interdisciplinary team in every clinic over time has been, you know, there are just a lot of files and group work we're working with firefighters on. And so these learnings and collaborations, again, so Nate, if you want to share your slides, I'll introduce you next, because we want to talk about learnings and collaborations provincially, nationally, and internationally. So Dr. Nathan DeBonno is a scientist in epidemiology with the IARC Monographs program in Lyon, France. He's also an affiliate scientist with the Occupational Cancer Research Center and an adjunct faculty member with Dalla Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. So welcome, Nate.
Thanks so much, Kimberly. So just 2 minutes ago, I had my slides all ready, and then I started to have internet problems. And so I'm trying to bring my slides back up.
Jennifer can do that for you. Yep, it's
yes,
coming.
maybe we can get the PDF version. Although I did make some changes to my slides, but that's okay. I will just roll with it. So yeah,
you can keep trying. Jennifer can try. We can meet in the middle here somewhere. But Jen, are you good to give it a shot?
I'll pull them up.
Thank you.
Sure, that would be great. I apologize. Of course, this happened at the worst possible time.
That's what backup's all about. We're good.
Yeah, exactly. Oh wait, I think I got them actually. Okay, I think it's working now.
Okay, you try.
It's working.
Great.
Just give me one moment.
Yeah. Since you have changes, you try first, and then Jennifer's right there for you.
Yes, that would be great.
We can also, Nate, maybe also turn off the cameras just to see if that supports you as well. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think yeah, it's just yeah, I think it'll be okay. It's just loading right now.
No worries. Thanks so much.
Sorry about that. Yeah, just be one more second.
Yeah. And thanks, Sarah, I've removed my camera as well, just in case.
Wonderful. Okay.
You're rocking and rolling. Looks good.
All right. Can everyone see my slides?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Sorry about that. So yeah, thank you, Kimberly, again for introducing me. I'm Nate DeBonno. I'm a scientist with the Monographs program at IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer. It's part of the World Health Organization. We're based in Lyon, France. And yeah, today I'm just going to give sort of an overview of the Monographs process and discuss some of the results from the Firefighters monograph that Steve mentioned just now. And I'm also going to provide some resources from our website that I think would be useful for everyone. So with that, I'll just get started. So what is the IARC Monographs program? So essentially, it's a program of the World Health Organization to identify carcinogenic hazards to humans. And as I said, we're based in Lyon in France. And essentially what we do is we convene panels or working groups, as we call them, of scientists from all over the world to review all of the evidence of carcinogenicity about a given agent or exposure. So at the end of this process, it's usually a week-long meeting in France. We produce a monograph book, which compiles all of the evidence in one place and provides an overall evaluation about the carcinogenicity of a given agent. So that just means whether the agent is capable of causing cancer in humans at any level of exposure. So is it a carcinogenic hazard? That's really what the program is focused on identifying. So the Monographs program just celebrated our 50-year anniversary. So this is the 50th year that the Monographs program has been producing these monographs. We've evaluated over 1,000 agents in that time. These include things like chemical, physical, biological agents, pharmaceutical drugs, dietary additives or foods, dietary exposures, lifestyle factors, occupational exposures particularly. So occupational exposures are frequently evaluated in the Monographs program. They're a very prominent feature of the Monographs, and I just have some examples here, recent examples from the welding fumes monograph, the night shift work monograph, and I also have an example of the tobacco smoking monograph, just to give you an idea of some of the scope of the agents that we evaluate. Occupational exposures are a really important part of the priority agents of the Monographs program, and we also evaluate occupations themselves, like we did with firefighting, which I'll talk about in a moment. But I just wanted to mention that studies of cancer in workers and exposed workers are often really critical to a lot of Monographs evaluations. As we know, unfortunately, a lot of workers are exposed to very high levels of potential hazards and carcinogenic hazards in the workplace at levels much higher than what we normally see in the general population. So yeah, workers definitely make a huge contribution to the work of the Monographs. I can advance here. Yeah. And so yeah, and these overall evaluations that we produce, so many of you may be familiar with this, but we classify agents at the end of the monograph into an overall evaluation, which is group 1, group 2A, group 2B, or group 3. And so group 1 means that the agent has been identified as a carcinogenic hazard to humans. And group 2A, probably carcinogenic, 2B, possibly carcinogenic, and group 3 is not classifiable. And so you can just see how many agents we've classified into each grouping over our 50-year history here. So over 122 agents as of June have been classified as a group 1 carcinogen. And yeah, so just this past June, we had the volume 132 of our Monographs, volume 132 meeting in Lyon, France, and we evaluated the carcinogenicity of occupational exposure as a firefighter. So this was an evaluation of the occupation itself. Do we see evidence of a carcinogenic hazard among people who work in the occupation? We invited 25 working group members from 8 countries from all around the world to review hundreds, if not thousands, of studies pertaining to firefighting and the risk of cancer. And yeah, this is just a photo of us this past June at the IARC building in France. And so I just want to, yeah, so explain a little bit about how the working group is structured. How does this process work? And so essentially the working group is divided into 4 different subgroups. And so we have subgroup 1, which is focused on characterizing the exposure in humans. So what is the agent? How are people exposed? How prevalent is the exposure? Just characterizing all aspects of the exposure. And then subgroup 2 is the subgroup focused on the evidence for cancer in humans. And we call this the human cancer evidence subgroup. And this really is where all of the epidemiological studies of human firefighters gets reviewed and evaluated. Then in subgroup 3, that is the cancer in experimental animals subgroup. So they review all of the animal evidence. Of course, for the firefighters monograph, there was no animal evidence. There are no mice or rats who work as firefighters. So that subgroup didn't apply to this meeting, but normally it's a very important subgroup. And then finally, subgroup 4 is the mechanistic subgroup. And so they evaluate the cellular mechanisms of carcinogenicity and the key characteristics of carcinogens, which I think our next speaker will talk about in a lot of detail. But so subgroup 2, 3, and 4 provide all of the evidence. Those are 3 different evidence streams that each do their own evaluation of their own bodies of evidence, and then it kind of comes together into an overall evaluation at the end, which I'll talk about. And that's the group 1, 2A, 2B, group 3 evaluation. But so that's how it's generally structured. And so I'll just talk about how the human cancer evidence subgroup, that's subgroup 2, evaluates all of the evidence in their section. So like I mentioned, each subgroup does their own evaluation, but I'll just focus on the cancer in humans. And so for the human cancer evidence subgroup, again, these are studies of firefighters who have been diagnosed or followed up for cancer and had the risk of cancer evaluated. They can, the evaluation can be either sufficient evidence for cancer in humans, limited evidence, or inadequate evidence. There's also a fourth category called evidence suggesting lack of carcinogenicity, or ESLC, which is not very common in the monographs, but usually it's the first three that the subgroup has to deliberate on. And so sufficient evidence for cancer in humans means that a causal relationship in the body of epidemiological evidence has been established, and that other sources of error or alternative explanations for a finding of an increased risk can be ruled out with reasonable confidence. So chance, we call this chance bias confounding, can be ruled out. An evaluation of limited evidence means that a causal interpretation is credible. However, they could not rule out all of the uncertainty or other sources of error or other competing explanations for evidence of an increased risk. And then inadequate evidence simply means that the studies don't permit a conclusion to be drawn because they are not of sufficient quality or simply that no data was available. And then ESLC just simply means that there is evidence that the agent does not cause cancer, but as I mentioned, it's not very common. So the important thing to know with these evaluations is that all of these evaluations in the human cancer evidence subgroup are specific to a given cancer type or cancer site. So for the firefighters monograph, the subgroup had to deliberate on an evaluation for many cancer sites: kidney cancer, prostate, non-Hodgkin lymphoma, mesothelioma. So each of these evaluations is specific to a given cancer site. It's not to any cancer at all. So it's just important to keep in mind. So yeah, and then as I mentioned, all of the three evidence streams sort of come together at the end of the meeting. And that's how that overall evaluation gets determined. And so this figure just shows the formula that we use to classify agents into that final overall evaluation. So for example, if the human cancer evidence subgroup has a sufficient evaluation, meaning sufficient evidence for carcinogenicity for any cancer site, that is all that is required for the overall evaluation of the agent to be a group 1 known carcinogen. However, and it doesn't really matter what the other subgroups say. Alternatively, if there's no human cancer evidence at all, but there's sufficient evidence of cancer in experimental animals and strong mechanistic evidence in exposed humans, that is also all that is required to get the agent to a group 1 overall evaluation. And so one of the points that I just want to make here is that we often tend to get really focused on the human cancer evidence, but as we know, there are many issues and challenges with epidemiological studies of cancer in humans. They can be very time consuming. You have to follow people for a long time. You have to have really good exposure data, which can be very difficult to obtain from companies. And so the mechanistic evidence and the animal evidence, these other evidence streams can be really important for monographs evaluations and for developing evidence of carcinogenicity. And then you can see the same kind of logic follows for the other two evaluations, probably carcinogenic and possibly carcinogenic. So if you have limited evidence in humans and strong evidence, mechanistic evidence, that can also move the evaluation to 2A, et cetera. So that's just how it works. And I think it's important for people to sort of understand how the monographs gets to these kinds of overall evaluations. So as I think our previous speaker, Steve, showed this infographic as well, but IARC has produced a bunch of communication materials on our website based on the results of the firefighters evaluation. So this is just an infographic that we produced, and all of this is available on our website. But so occupational exposure as a firefighter was identified as carcinogenic to humans on the basis of sufficient evidence for cancer in humans. So that means that the evidence for mesothelioma was really all that was required to bring that evaluation to group 1, because we saw sufficient evidence of a causal relationship for mesothelioma in firefighters. And we also saw the same thing for bladder cancer, although the magnitude of the strength of the association that we saw was smaller. It was very consistent, very robust to different competing explanations and sources of bias. And then for the other 5 cancer sites, colon, prostate, testicular, melanoma, non-Hodgkin lymphoma, these cancer types were evaluated in the human cancer evidence subgroup as having limited evidence because they couldn't fully rule out alternative explanations for some of the relationships that we were seeing. So these findings were a little bit more equivocal compared to those for mesothelioma and bladder. And then just to sort of wrap things up, I just wanted to mention if you are someone who reads monographs or if you want to read monographs, all of the monographs are available for free on our website, and they're available in PDF format, so you can download any monograph that you want. And I'd recommend going to section 5 of every monograph, which provides a summary of all of the evidence that was evaluated in each subgroup and the sort of the rationale for the evaluation and conclusion that they came to. And it's written in very plain language, it's very accessible, and so it's a really good resource if you want sort of an accessible summary, a brief summary of the monograph. For any monograph, it's a really good place to look. And then obviously section 6 always has the evaluations, which is written in this very sort of formulaic language, which is very clear and sort of easy to understand. So that's just, yeah, something I thought would be useful to share. And then if you want details about the monographs process, our procedures, our guidelines, how we choose our working group members, how we manage conflicts of interest in the program, how we, the formula for the overall evaluation that I just shared, how we weigh the informativeness and quality of the different evidence streams. All of that is available in our preamble, which is sort of like our constitution, our guiding document. And it's at the beginning of every monograph book, but it's also available for download on our website as well. And then, so yeah, just thinking about the future, what agents are we going to evaluate next? You can actually go on our website again and find our priorities document. And this lists all of the high priority agents that we've identified to review in a future monograph within the next 5 years. And so we have an advisory group that helps put this together, but we also receive nominations and recommendations for this. And it's a really useful document to see you know, which agents and exposures out there might be of concern for as a carcinogenic hazard, but maybe have not been evaluated yet. And it gives some indication of the evidence that is sort of driving it as a priority for review. So it's just a very useful resource, I think. And then finally, this is my last slide. You can actually nominate agents for evaluation in the Monographs program. And I think a lot of people don't know this, but we do have a form on our website where you can go and nominate an agent for evaluation in a future monograph. And I guarantee you that our staff reviews every single nomination that comes in. So if there is an agent that you think warrants a review for carcinogenicity and it's not already on our priorities list, you can go ahead and fill out this form and contact me if you need any information about it. And we will definitely have a look at it. Yeah, and that's all I have for today. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Nate, and thanks for sticking around for questions shortly after our next speaker. So we are moving around the world and talking nationally now with Steve in the States and Nate in France and in Canada, and back over to nationally with Dr. Alexandra Long. Alexandra, if you're here and want to go ahead and share your slides while I introduce you, you're more than welcome. Dr. Alexandra Long completed her PhD in biology with a specialization in chemical and environmental toxicology from here at the University of Ottawa. Her PhD research focused on the genetic toxicity of complex mixtures of the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. She completed her NSERC postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Toronto in the Department of Pharmacology and Toxicology. Alexandra previously worked for over a decade as a research biologist in a genetic toxicology lab at Health Canada, and is currently a scientific evaluator with the Emerging Approaches Unit, where she develops and interprets new approach methodologies and assesses their readiness and utility for risk assessment. She's participated in 2 IARC monographs as a working group member. So welcome, Alexandra.
Thank you so much. You can hear me okay?
Perfectly, and your slides are are great.
Excellent. Okay, great. Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you for having me here today. I was really fortunate to get to participate in the IARC monograph evaluation of occupational exposure as a firefighter that happened earlier this year. And so today I'm happy to be able to share some information about the mechanistic data and specifically the genetic toxicity data related to evidence for cancer in firefighters. Got to get my slides changing here. There we go. And so you're familiar with this type of figure. Dr. DeBonno showed a very similar one. And I think, you know, when we talk about evidence for cancer in humans and cancer in animals, it's kind of clear what we're talking about, but sometimes the mechanistic data for cancer can be a bit more of a black box. And so I'm going to be focusing on this today. And what we really mean is we're using this key characteristics of human carcinogens as a framework that the data for mechanistic data for cancer in humans is being organized around. And so these key characteristics were determined following a large review of many IARC human carcinogens of various types, so like occupational exposures, chemicals, viruses, drugs, fibers, different types of carcinogens. And what they found was that across these various types of carcinogens, they frequently had one or more of these key characteristics in common. And so for occupational exposure as a firefighter, we had data for 7 of these key characteristics. But today I'm really going to focus on just the genotoxicity mechanism, as I'm a genetic toxicologist. And so what do we mean by genotoxicity or genetic toxicity? So genetic toxicity starts with the induction of genetic damage. And so this can occur inside of cells due to normal processes, but it can also be induced by chemicals or occupational exposures, environmental exposures. And so this can damage your DNA, which is the coding blocks of life here. And so you can end up with different types of genetic damage. And so genetic damage like this can still be repaired or bypassed without causing any further downstream issues. But if this doesn't occur, if it's not properly repaired, this can lead to more permanent changes in your DNA. So this can cause mutations where you can see here this DNA, a base in DNA, this G has changed to a C. And so this will affect all of the cells that come from this cell with this mutation, and it could potentially have functional consequences, or it can affect chromosomes, which is what the DNA is packaged into. And so you could either have a gain or loss of an entire chromosome, or you could lose a piece of your chromosome. And these can also have functional consequences in this cell and all the cells that arise from it. If we get in accumulations of these types of genetic damage, it can result in cancer, which we're really concerned with through the IARC program, but also different types of diseases and disorders. And if it happens in a germ cell, for example, a sperm or an egg, this can result in heritable genetic diseases that can impact future generations. And so that's why why genetic toxicity is important and why it is related to cancer, an earlier event. And so one of the things I wanted to point out with this slide is that we can use different assays or tests to detect different stages of genetic toxicity. And so you can use different tests to look at the genetic damage itself, which at this stage can still be properly repaired, or you can use different tests to look at mutations or chromosomal abnormalities as well. And so how do we do this in humans? So we have 2 assays that we can use to look at genetic damage. So that first kind of initial damage event that can be repaired. One of them is called the COMET assay. In this case, the results are pretty short-lived or transient, and so you would want to collect your samples about 4 to 6 hours after exposure. For DNA adducts, these can stick around for a bit longer. In this case, it's when a chemical is kind of stuck to the DNA, and this can cause problems. These can be repaired, but they do stick around for a bit longer. We can also have use the micronucleus assay in order to detect these gain or loss of chromosomes or these breakage of chromosomes. And then it's actually very difficult to look at mutations in exposed humans. There's some new technology that we're starting to use, but we don't see it very often still because it is quite expensive. But one of the things we can do is use a bacterial mutation assay, so where you're detecting a sequence change in the DNA. And we're kind of hacking this to use in humans, so I'll explain that on the next slide. So this is called the AIM Salmonella assay. It happens in bacteria. It's a super common assay that we use in the lab, usually just with chemicals, where we want to know whether or not this chemical can cause mutations. So we would expose the bacteria to a chemical, and then if it causes mutations, it's going to cause these colonies or these white circles to grow. And so you can count up these colonies, and it gives you an indication of how potent or how good the chemical is at inducing mutations. So in this case, what we can do is instead of exposing the bacteria to a chemical, we can actually expose it to a concentrated urine extract. And so this urine has passed through a person. So we collect the urine, we can then concentrate it down, and then we can expose it to the bacteria. And so we're using the bacteria basically as a surrogate to determine, to kind of replicate what the body was exposed to as these chemicals pass through the body. And so that's how we're using, that's one of the ways we are able to look at mutations in human studies. So this is called urinary mutagenicity. And so the sample time and collection is also really important in these types of studies because you're trying to capture that window in time that those chemicals are passing through the body and that they're going to come out in your urine. And so usually you'd want to collect the samples within 24 hours, but this can be tricky depending on shift length. If it's a 24-hour shift, you might need to start collecting the urine right after the shift. And so these are the types of things we need to pay attention to, and we're reviewing all the studies. So in the mechanistic data, you can have different types of studies. So you can have exposed human studies, you can have studies in human cells, and then you can have studies in experimental systems like animals, non-human mammalian cells, and bacterial cells. But in this case, because it's an occupational exposure, the vast majority of the data was in exposed humans. And this is great because this is the most relevant data since we're trying to make a classification about cancer in humans. For the firefighter monograph, we saw kind of two of the more common types of studies we saw were pre-post sampling for mechanistic studies. And so in this case, the firefighters serve as their own controls. You collect a urine sample from the firefighters before a shift or before an exposure event, as well as following the shift or exposure event. And then you can compare the results between the two samples. And so the types of studies in this class were on-shift studies that involved a fire event. And then we also had some training course studies. Another type of study we call a cross-sectional study. In this case, it was firefighters that were being compared with a non-firefighter control population. And then two types of studies we had that were in this class were firefighters that were sampled following a fire event versus a control population, or just samples obtained from firefighters kind of at the time of sample collection, but not necessarily following a specific exposure event. So it wasn't following a shift or a fire. They just decided to collect samples from firefighters and compared them with controls. Okay, so, oops, I can't see the top of my screen anymore. So now I'm going to start presenting some of the data. Let me see if I can get this out of the way here. I'm not sure why this.
We don't see what you see. We see your slide perfectly.
It was, I didn't have the drop down before, but it just showed up. Anyways, I was able to move it to my other screen, so I can see the whole screen again. Sorry about that. Okay, so getting into some of the data, this here, it was a study where they looked at urinary mutagenicity. So that's that type of test where they're using bacteria that's being exposed to urine concentrates to see if it's causing mutations. This was a Canadian municipal firefighter study of the Ottawa Fire Service. This was conducted by my friend and colleague, Janice was the first author, a PhD student. You can see she's here at a training fire. And this was actually a fire that happened about 2 blocks from my house at the time in Ottawa. And it was one of the fires that was in this study. These samples were collected before and after on-shift fire suppression events. And it also included an unexposed control group. So 17 office workers were included as a separate control group. In this study, they didn't consume charbroiled food and they weren't exposed to non-occupational combustion sources throughout the study, which is important because other types of exposures can also cause the same signal that we're trying to detect from the fire exposure. And so we know that if you eat a lot of charbroiled food, it will also cause a spike in urinary mutagenicity. And so this was a good way to try to control for that. And then they carried out exposure assessment. So they used personal air monitors in order to detect the chemicals in the air that they were exposed to. They used dermal wipes to detect chemicals on the skin that they're exposed to, and then the urine metabolites. So they analyzed the urine for chemicals as well, kind of both specifically focusing on polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons as well as some other mutagens. Now we're not changing slides again. Here we go. Okay, and here's the results from the study. So on the y-axis here, we have the urinary mutagenicity. Over here, we have the office workers, and then we have the samples obtained from the firefighters before the fire, as well as the samples obtained from the firefighters after the fire. And here, just comparing the pre and post samples here, you can see that there was a 4.3-fold increase in the urinary mutagenicity in the samples after the fire in comparison with before the fire. And the highest change was actually up to 75-fold, probably this individual up here. They also compared both of these populations with the office worker controls, and there was a significant increase in the urinary mutagenicity in the after fire samples compared with the office workers. However, we didn't see a change here between the pre-fire samples and the office worker samples, which indicates that the levels of urinary mutagenicity may drop back down kind of to baseline in between exposures, which is a good thing. The next study also used urinary mutagenicity. This was a study, an American study of wildland firefighters. The samples were collected around a prescribed burn day and then a non-burn day work shift. The samples were collected immediately before the shift, immediately after the shift, and then the morning following the shift. There was 19 firefighters, and for the exposure assessment, they used air monitors for PM2.5, which would be the particulate matter that's present in the combustion emissions or the smoke. So the results for the urinary mutagenicity for the burn day are shown here on this plot. We have the pre-shift sample, the post-shift sample, and the next morning sample. And there was a significant increase in the urinary mutagenicity in the post-shift sample compared with the pre-shift sample. However, we didn't see a significant difference with the next morning versus post-shift, although you can see that it has dropped back down very similar to the pre-shift sample. However, it's possible they're still excreting some additional urinary metabolites at this time that are mutagenic. When you look at the non-burn day results, you can see the results are pretty consistent across all 3 time points, and so we don't see that kind of spike in mutagenicity following the shift. So that also helps us indicate that, that mutagenicity is likely caused by compounds in the fire that they're exposed to. These cross-shift changes in urinary mutagenicity were significantly associated with the length of smoke exposure. This next study is a Danish study. They used this COMET assay, which is one of the tests to look at DNA damage, and they did this in blood samples. This was a 9-month firefighter training course, and the samples were collected specifically around the 3-day course that involved fire extinction exercises. The samples were collected 14 days before, immediately after the 3-day course, and then 14 days after the course. There were 12 female and 41 male non-smoking firefighters, and they also carried out exposure assessments. So they used dermal wipes, and they also looked at urine metabolites to look for compounds from combustion emissions. Here we have the results for the DNA damage. So that's on the y-axis here, and you can see the mean results in black. You can see there is kind of a slight peak here for rising from the before sample to the right after the collection sample, and then it kind of falls back down to the 14-day after. And there was a significant difference between the post-exposure and the 14-day after exposure sample. There was not a difference between before and after. You can see that there are a number of individual results. All the individual results are traced in gray, and so there are a number of individual results that are much more flat. But then there are also a number of individual results that have these quite dramatic peaks here following exposure. However, this is the mean result in black. They also correlated the DNA damage results with biomarkers of exposure. And so they saw that the DNA damage frequency was positively correlated with skin total polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon concentration, skin pyrene concentration, and urinary 1-hydroxypyrene concentration. And so these are PAHs or PAH metabolites that are known to be present in smoke or combustion emissions.
Alexandra, it's just me checking on time. We still have lots. That's the, you know, you going last. This is what happens. But I just did want to just check in with you and make sure you knew we had about 10 minutes left.
Okay, sure. I can go through these quick then. So this study is another DNA damage study. This was again in blood. It was in wildland firefighters. There was no specific exposure event. So there was 60 volunteer wildland firefighters compared with 63 office worker controls. And so you can see the results here. In orange, we have the firefighter samples for DNA damage compared with the control population, and there was a significant increase in the firefighter samples. These were then stratified by gender, and you see a similar trend, but it was not a significant difference. And then they were stratified by age, where again, you're seeing the same trend and only significant for the 29 to 38-year-olds. This study looked at DNA adducts. This is where a chemical is kind of stuck to a piece of DNA, and this is a type of DNA damage in blood. This was an American study of municipal firefighters, 43 male firefighters compared with 40 male controls. And they analyzed the blood samples to determine whether or not there was a presence or absence of this type of damage in the blood samples, specifically looking for this chemical or similar chemicals to this chemical that is present in combustion emissions. And they did find a significant odds ratio when controlling for both white race and the consumption of charbroiled food as in the firefighters versus control. And this is the last study here. So this is the micronucleus and micronucleus study. This was an Indian study of municipal firefighters, a cross-sectional study again, so firefighters versus control. And they also found a significant increase in the micronuclei. This is an exfoliated buccal epithelial cells from your mouth, 3.1-fold increase in firefighters versus control. And so that's some of the mechanistic studies that I wanted to share with you today that contributed to the overall call of strong mechanistic evidence in exposed firefighters. That was just for genotoxicity, which was one of the 5 key characteristics that had consistent and coherent evidence. And so overall, as Nate showed, that there was a call of sufficient for cancer in humans, which led to an overall evaluation of group 1. And so the mechanistic evidence didn't kind of affect the overall evaluation, but it did help provide some mechanistic data that can kind of support some of the mechanisms that may be involved in causing cancer. And so that's everything. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Alexandra. And I think you answered already. Ina had a question about wildland firefighters and some Ina, do you want to unmute or ask your question? Or are you happy with the research that Alexandra showed? Or were you looking for something else in particular? She was asking.
Thanks so much. I appreciate seeing that some of the last studies included wildland firefighters.
Yes, definitely they were included in the monograph. So any studies that were relevant that were in wildland firefighters were included. And so we did have several in the mechanism section. And I think the ones I presented here were from the US and Portugal. Yeah, important.
Thanks so much. Any other questions for our panel? Steve and Nate are still here along with Alexandra. I know that's heavy on the science, but so interesting as well. You know, to remember the root of this being the feedback from the workers and the voice of the worker. And it's super interesting for us because we get a lot of kind of blind biological monitoring. We've been discussing as a working group in a couple of the clinics, and together with our interdisciplinary team, we've been chatting about how to look at them in comparison with biological exposure indices, and both from a medical surveillance perspective, and but I don't think any of us were looking at it from the perspective that you just shared, Alexandra. So yeah, now we might know one of the roots of where these requests are coming from, because it's Ottawa based. So sometimes it's geography that some of the firefighters might have been involved in some of these studies with you guys. So, and that Paul spoke about last year. Any other questions for Dr. DeBonno or hey Todd? Yeah, you want to chat about that?
Just to follow up on that, is there, like, on biological monitoring, and that was really interesting with the genotoxicity, but what about, like, we get randomly sent lab reports that include heavy metals, acetylcholinesterase, various other things that I'm just trying to work out actually now with Neil McMillan and others, like where, what's the source of this? Well, I know the firefighters get an annual stipend to get a blood test, but who's deciding what should be ordered, like prescribed, and what do you do with the results? Like, aside from the genotoxicity and mechanistic, are there people that are mapping exposure from biological monitoring results in either blood or urine? Can anybody answer that?
So this is, I was not personally involved in these firefighter studies, but I can definitely take a stab at that question. I think the exposure and the biological monitoring is extremely important because we have a wealth of data about individual types of chemicals and the types of toxicity that they induce from lab studies that, it can be hard to kind of tease apart those effects that when they're happening in a complex mixture like firefighters are exposed to when they respond to fires. And so if we have that biological monitoring data and we know that these specific types of compounds can induce a specific type of toxicity, this is really important as well. And then it also can help with trying to reduce exposure. So what type of interventions or PPEs is resulting in reduced exposure to those compounds if we know that they are toxic. And so that would just be,
yeah, one
part of the equation.
Yeah, one of our issues is what is a normal range? I mean, all labs have different analytical techniques. They have different ranges that they report. Often they're based on general public, or in one case, one lab used their lab techs as the people that were, and they have no occupational exposure or nothing, So that what to do with these results, and I know trending is one key, right? Like baseline and trending, but often we throw up our arms and we're just trying to work out what gets some meaning out of these, kind of random biological monitoring results that we get. I think Steve's open. Steve, you may have.
I think we might add Health Canada to our working group, Todd. Along with Steve and Neil, so it'd be good. Yeah,
for sure.
I don't know if this gets to where you want to be, but I know the U.S.'s NIOSH, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, is trying to establish an exposure monitoring program that's wide open and encouraging people to put information in there. I don't know what level of detail will be available to put in things like that. And there's an associated program through I think it's a grant funded program through, I can't remember, I think the sponsor might be the International Association of Fire Chiefs, but called N4s, that have an exposure registry up and running. I don't know how those two things are going to interrelate, but I think you make an excellent point about what type of data needs to get in there. I don't know how welcome people will feel to put their medical data in there, but it's supposed to be anonymous and strictly for data gathering purposes. So
you're talking about total worker health, Steve? Is that the NIOSH program you're speaking about?
No, I think this one's called the Firefighter Registry.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
And I think originally it had origins in exposures that are medical in nature, but I think they're also trying to wrap in behavioral health too, so that maybe there is a really total employee
We have work
vibe
to
to
do.
it. It's not up and running though. Yeah, and
Yeah.
until we see it, we won't know what it
Yeah.
includes.
Great. Well, we're
There's
going
a
to
couple
follow
of
up with
extra
you and Neil
questions. Yeah.
and Health
Yeah.
Canada and
Definitely.
everybody. Thanks very much.
Thanks. And Andrew is asking if there was consideration, and Nate's gone, but Alexandra may know, and Steve even, if there's consideration for other closely related first responders and paramedics, for example, because we've been getting cases where we've been drawing parallels to the exposure at the same scene, right, from paramedics or other first responders. Was that a consideration in the monograph assessment?
Not directly. So the data that we evaluated was really for firefighters. There were occasions when I think in potentially some control groups, and I can't speak to all of the data in the monograph because honestly there was so many, and
Right.
I can't say for sure there wasn't, but occasionally there were first responders that were lumped into a control group for, kind of one-off studies. I can think of one for the terrorist attack, one of the terrorist attack study that was in the monograph where there was first responders kind of included in a general control group. And so I believe that data was summarized and reported, but really it was specifically on firefighters. So it included volunteer firefighters, it included forest firefighters, municipal firefighters, but it was for firefighters rather than first responders in general.
Great. And Paul was involved in that. Thank you, Paul. So he's sending the NIOSH registry that Steve's talking about as well to help answer some of those questions and to support. Thank you, Paul, through Sarah. And we are a tiny bit behind. I will let people go. I just check out our session next week on, giving tools to help with all of this. Danny's asking a great question that kind of built on what Steve was talking about with dirty gear and dermal exposure. He's asking specifically to Alexandra if if the sources of carcinogens can be attributed to non-firefighting activities. I don't know, Danny, if you want to unmute.
I'm aware of a study by Jennifer Keir that they did look at sources of some of these carcinogens on gear and then before and after washing. And so the laundry of the gear removed between 61 to 98% of the surface contamination, depending on the chemicals they were trying to track. But certainly the gear is also contaminated.
Right. And Steve was showing how, where the gear doesn't cover kind of thing is interesting as well through those tracer studies. So I'm sorry we ran out of time. We think we addressed all the questions in the chat. It has been wonderful for both part 1 and part 2 today, hoping to merge and bridge the gap between the worker's voice and science. And that's all what we're all looking to do. And hope you can join us again next week. And please check out, Sarah, yes, over to you.
Yes, and one more plug. Thanks, Kimberly. I just wanted to say we are really hoping to try to get more feedback on these presentations. So we'd love to hear from you. I've put the link in the chat for the survey, but please fill that out and hopefully we'll be able to keep improving these presentations, making sure we're getting the material that you want to use. So yeah, thanks for that, everybody, and thanks for being here.
So important. Thanks, Sarah. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Janice. Take care, everyone. Thanks to all our speakers. Sorry, we knew we were tight today. Cheers.